going to throw something onto that background so that it's not quite.
I'm excited to see what goes onto your green screen.
Such a green screen.
I don't have anything very exciting, I'll tell you that. So there you go, that'll do.
That looks great.
That's nice and bland. I like it. Good. Sounds great. So, and I'll also bring up my questions here, and then we'll be good to go.
Excellent.
Awesome.
I hit minor technical issues while I was setting up this morning when my computer decided that it wanted to connect to my scales for my Wi-Fi, and therefore couldn't get anything on the internet. Yeah, exactly. I changed the batteries.
The future we live in.
It's
correct. So, in terms of intro, I'm happy to intro myself.
That'd be
I'm also
great.
happy to intro you, Mike, and pump you up. I'm happy to be a hype man. So
yeah, do it. I won't do it myself, so I'm grateful to you to do it. That's great. Thank you.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Great. So, g'day to everybody out there. My name is Morgan Jaffit, and I've been a game developer in Australia and around the world for the last 20 years. I've worked on everything from the Hand of Fate series with Defiant Development through to Homeworld, Freedom Force, and a number of games at different studios around the world. It is my great pleasure today to be talking with Mike Bithell, the creator of many games, from Thomas Was Alone to the recently announced and possibly imminently out by the time you read this, Solitaire Conspiracy. Writer of books on game development, creator of podcasts, and a multi-talented writer, designer, studio manager. It's a great pleasure to have Mike here, and go wishlist Solitaire Conspiracy right now, or buy it if it's out.
Or buy it if it's out, whichever one.
And then come. That's right, and then come back and listen to this.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro. I will correct you on one point because I'm big on credit. The book I didn't write. I did the foreword. I wrote 2 pages of the book, but it was written by a guy called Mike Futter, who did a really great job on it.
Excellent.
It was all round lovely, but I just want to make sure I don't take credit for his work. But yeah, other than that, the rest of it all on my own. Yeah. So, it's fine. I did all those games entirely on my own. It was great.
Well, actually, that's one of the things I want to talk about today. The themes for the conference are connection and ambition, and you have a great track record of ambitious titles, of breaking new ground in multiple places at multiple times, and building really great teams and connecting really great people. And I think that's a big part of the reason that you make so much sense as an opening keynote for the show. But before we kind of wind back through that whole historical process, I know you've talked about those sorts of things a lot. I'd love to start talking about the new hotness and talk about Solitaire Conspiracy. That's just gone gold, right?
I may have jumped the gun by announcing it.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess 2020 game dev. Like it's not really gold until, I don't know, 2 years after release, right? It's pretty much there. We're just tracking down. We had a fun bug today where the game got confused and thought that the title text on the screen was a card and tried to shuffle it, which is some fantastic kind of emergence. Like, I want to make that game. That sounds really interesting.
That is awesome. I love card game nonsense. So you're right in my wheelhouse.
Well, this is your I'm definitely like I'm doing like the early learning center version of what you do. I'm like baby's first card game is what I'm making at the moment. But so it's been fun. Yeah. So we've been just figuring that out and just fixing some localization stuff and stuff. So we're very close. I think we're sending it out to critics tomorrow, hopefully, as of recording this. So we'll see what they think. Yeah.
Well, then I appreciate even more you giving us the time today.
No worries.
What at the core is the experience you want to give to people through Solitaire Conspiracy?
So for us, it was again kind of thinking, and we do tend to we start with that every time. We start with kind of where do we want to put the player? What's the kind of the mindset? The kind of what's the role play, I guess, ultimately, which is maybe a kind of old school way of thinking about games, but it kind of helps us to get into it. So with this one, yeah, it is literally okay. I kind of want something that's relatively low stress, but has the trappings of something cool and interesting and exciting. But I've had enough. There's enough action and drama in the world around me. I kind of want something that I can almost that's kind of an ambient thing. And we wanted to kind of make something that was kind of, and Solitaire was a really interesting way into that because it is a game. I mean, it's called Patience in the UK traditionally, and I assume in Australia as well. Because it's a game that's not actually meant to be stressful or hard. It's about patience. It's about just going through. It's one up from a clicker, right? And what was interesting was taking Solitaire and that kind of core idea, and then just doing that little bit of extra we've done with like the powers, which are these kind of basically Mario Kart power-ups you can get essentially that kind of will allow you to mix up how the Solitaire is done. It's just enough that it becomes an interesting tactical experience, but at its heart, it is basically just sit back, breathe. We're going to give you something that feels like a strategy kind of adventure action story thing, FMV cutscenes. It's red alert, eat your heart out, like with all these kind of ridiculous FMVs. But at the same time, like it's trying to create that vibe rather than doing something more complex and more stressful. That said, we then added a time attack mode because we're still game designers. So we put that on top of it as well. But like, no, it's going for that. It's going for that kind of lazy Sunday game, which is what those shorts we've done with the circular games as well kind of were in the same vein. They're kind of they're experiential. They're kind of holodeck programs. They're not designed to test you. They're designed to be places to visit and have that experience and that vibe we've tried to create. So it's kind of more of that.
Is it accurate to say? I think I've read comments from you talking about the fact that the theme as a spy story came after that kind of mechanical decision making. So it's really interesting to me that you were sitting down and thinking about vibe and player experience and the way they relate, and then coming to the theme after that. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to spies are right for this? Well,
spies, obviously, right? Spies is the most chilled out genre of cinema. I think for me, actually, I think the weird thing, and it's funny, it's this fantastic thing whenever, because I've not done many kind of interviews or conversations about Solitaire, so I've not really thought. Yeah. I feel like I form a lot of my like really wise thoughts through the process of talking about my games.
I understand that one.
Much more. Yeah, it's something you feel out in the moment. You're just kind of doing what you're problem solving, right, day to day in the moment. But then when you sit down, so what's interesting about that, because my immediate response to that question is like, yeah, actually, spies make no sense what I just said. But the thing for me is when I want to relax, the first thing I do is stick on a Marvel movie, a Mission Impossible movie, a kind of and one of those kind of comfy action movies that we've all seen 20 times. Yeah. So I wonder if that was kind of the thinking there. Maybe that was the link. But again, it was problem solving in the moment. Like it was basically we had this game. We knew it was going to be about having different suits of cards. We knew we wanted the face cards to be characters. So we had these crews. We had like teams of 3 people, and we wanted 8 suits in the game and all this kind of thing. And we were playing with that. And I think one of the original thoughts, most of my games start off as Star Trek ripoffs. So it's the same is true of Subsurface Circular, same is true of North Star Rising, which was this podcast radio drama we did. They all start as Star Trek, and then I realized Star Trek's really hard to make. So I don't do Star Trek, and I pulled back. So it started off kind of space operatic, but then the idea of like, well, are they ships then? Are these ships? I think the metaphor didn't really work for the cards. I knew I didn't want to do fantasy because that's what a lot of the other games were, and I kind of wanted to spin off somewhere different. I'm also much more comfortable in sci-fi. That's a well I keep going back to. And then I think Spies was honestly the way of approaching doing, essentially, I think we started thinking about like gangs and heists. And the feeling I had was I don't want to make a story about anti-heroes right now. Like I want heroes. I want to make positive stories. So it's if you want to do a heist movie, but you can't do that, then you do Fast and the Furious or a spy film, or you do what they did eventually with Fast and Furious and kind of combine those two. And that's what we've got. So we've got so those spy crews as well. What's really great about Spies is you've got these genres kind of established and the player already knows about. And that was a lesson we learned on John Wick, was playing into a certain number of stereotypes works really well from a game design point of view. People who we found out in playtesting with John Wick, that people who were fans of the movie were better at our game because they knew how you were meant to play it, because they knew the character, they knew how that action kind of worked in the movies. What's interesting with Spies is there's all these established genres, so we could go, okay, so there's the crew that's definitely Mission Impossible, there's the crew that's the Fast and the Furious gang, there's the crew that are James Bond, there's the crew that, and we could kind of build these 8 suits that feel very contrasting, but also kind of that through the lens of spy movies, you can kind of, you know where you are with that. And then that is AI and cyberpunk, because we're sci-fi nerds.
That's really interesting, and I'm particularly interested there in the discussion about the things learned from John Wick and how they pass on, because I think it's easy for people to look at your catalogue and go, there's a lot of different approaches, and there's an ambitious rethink every time. But there also is this sense of ongoing growth and learning and taking lessons from previous titles. And I wonder how you draw the thread through your work historically, but also in the moment when you're thinking about your next projects.
So, I mean, it's, again, definitely problem solving, like looking at what we have in that moment, like who's around, who do I want to work with next, what are the opportunities that are coming our way. Obviously, there's that kind of reactive element to it. But I think you're right to kind of point that out, that we do build between games more than people realize. And I feel that's one of the ways in which we create stuff that feels original. I think originality is, obviously such an important, or is perceived as such an important thing among games and games press and game fans. But often originality is just mixing 2 things people haven't mixed before, like just bringing in an idea from here and putting it in there, and you're suddenly the most original game ever. And we see that over and over again in the game industry, right? Those remixes. And what's interesting as a studio is if you have that as your kind of central tenet, that we will never make the same game twice, which is a rule we only broke once with. We did a Quarantine Circular, which was kind of an addition to Subsurface Circular, because the contract on John Wick was taking a while. So we needed something to do. Like we've definitely always pulled things through. So you can definitely draw a line of Thomas Was Alone was me kind of learning how to write. It was my first game I'd ever written. So it was kind of that learning process. Volume was, oh, wow, Thomas made money. We have to spend some money. That game did well within that context, but there were obviously a lot of kind of design things I didn't like about that game, or things I wanted to tweak. So we then go on and we start doing the circular games, where we're doing interactive fiction, and we're trying to build in that area because we're getting all these plaudits for being great game storytellers, and we've never actually told an interactive story, and that feels weird. So we kind of want to go and try that. John Wick is us kind of wanting to do more kind of in the strategy vein. But what you can do is you can start pulling stuff over. So there's UI ideas from Subsurface Circular that find their way into John Wick, the way John Wick does a lot of its tutorial stuff. And there's, I don't think any game designer has ever been proud of a tutorial, but like there's definitely problems in John Wick's tutorial, but like there's stuff in there that's very good, that's based on going from Subsurface Circular, where we had to teach an audience which maybe hadn't even played a game before how to kind of go through a process. And then, like you said, like with this, we take things we learned in the process of John Wick, which was amazing because it exposed us to just so many film people and TV people, who is a whole other world of kind of thought process. And a lot of it is utterly irrelevant to games, and we shouldn't try and make games into movies. But there are these little kind of moments, these pinpricks of information that you go, oh, that's a completely different way of looking at that. And that's something obviously we're talking a lot about now as we kind of go into this kind of, well, everyone's trying to build the Netflix of games kind of period. There's a lot of really interesting lessons in like the TV and film industry around that. So there's, we try and always be building from what we've seen before and what we can pull into future things. But it's, I'd be lying if I said that was born out of like any goal other than we like doing what we want to do. Like there's, it started off as just, what does Mike want to do next? As the company's grown, that's kind of become several other people. But we do kind of follow our hearts on stuff, because I definitely think, well, because people keep giving us the opportunity to, ultimately is kind of, I guess, the point. Like, I think if we weren't being given that opportunity, we'd very quickly make, 5 Thomas Was Alone sequels.
It's interesting having had some similar interactions with people on the film and TV side. I'm really interested in whether that John Wick experience, I'm interested in talking about whether there's other IPs you'd like to work on, and whether you see a future in that sort of business. But more than that, I'm interested if that's changed the way you look at building your own IPs, whether you're starting now to think about IPs that somebody else could then go and make the TV or the film of, or their own spin-off projects rather than the other way around.
Well, that's what's interesting about John Wick, was it kind of wasn't built as a franchise, and it's that kind of, it's really interesting going in on the ground, and obviously you have a lot of kind of honest and private conversations about the franchise when you go in those rooms. But the stuff I think everyone knows is John Wick started as this kind of small indie movie. No film studio would touch it because they break one of the core rules of cinema very quickly, and no one wanted to make that movie. And then because it did well, it kind of grows and turns into this sprawling world, and by 3 there's this enormous mythos. And I think it was very interesting because obviously as a game designer you go into that room. I remember like one of the early meetings just going to the room and going, you know, with my laptop, okay, so how much is a gold coin worth in the John Wick universe? And just everyone across the table from me going, I have no idea. Like whatever we need it to be worth by page 10, that's what it's worth. So it's kind of, so I kind of going into that and seeing a franchise that kind of blossomed without that planning. And then obviously a lot of franchises are very heavily planned and thought through. But it kind of feels like most of the hit franchises didn't grow that way. They started with one amazing thing and then blossomed. And that's true of, I'm trying to think of anything, trying to think of a big franchise that started with like, here's the first 5 movies. Maybe Harry Potter. I feel like Harry Potter was one that there was a bigger plot kind of thought through, but again, like it always requires one great thing first. So I think that was the big lesson for me with kind of these kind of the thoughts of franchise. And if we ever ended up trying to do something long term in that way, I think we would start by trying to make one excellent thing, and that's hard enough on its own, right? And if that works out, then you can go and do more. What we have been doing for years is quietly making all our games take place in the same narrative universe. There's loads of references back and forth, and there's loads of characters just in case, one of these games blows up. Then we've got this expanded universe we can kind of pull ideas from, and also just because it's fun, and there's 10 fans of our games who really enjoy it, so it's worth keep doing for them. But yeah, so it's I think it was instructive in that it was, as is true of many experiences in my career, realizing that, you know, there isn't some clever plan you've not been let in on. Most of the time, people are just trying to figure out how to make cool stuff. Like ultimately, that's what it comes down to. And then the skill comes in with those people who take something that's already successful and build on it and go with it. And that's something I'm terrible at, and that's something that we definitely have tried to figure out how to do better, kind of as time's gone on, in terms of porting our games to different platforms is something we just didn't do at the start because I didn't want to do it. And then now we've got process and people in place to kind of do that, which is great. But that also spins out to things like IP, things like merchandising, things like that. So we're slowly building up to it. But yeah, for me, it always comes back to you just got to make something excellent. And just making something excellent is something like, I think realistically, you know, we get maybe 3 or 4 of those in a career, right? Like 3 or 4 games that are like, if we're lucky, they're excellent. And you know, we just got to ride that wave when it comes.
I think that's a really good observation. There's a skill in building things from scratch, and there's a skill in working out how to shovel more coal into the fire when it starts, right? And
you need both kinds of people, right? I feel like that second group don't get the respect they deserve a lot of the time. I think we always prize innovation. It's always this visionary, what an amazing original thing. It's like, it's kind of more impressive when you've got 10 movies in the series and the 10th one is good. Like that's also a lot of very talented people making that happen. So I think games, I feel indie especially, there haven't really been many ongoing indie franchises, which is I wonder if that's an opportunity maybe down the road that someone's gonna do that. I mean, there's lots of sequels, of course, maybe 2 or 3. I guess Trine or Trine, I can never pronounce it right. That's probably the longest running one.
That's probably right. I feel like Clay does a good job of supporting their things in an ongoing fashion.
That's true.
And allowing each of those to build up. But I agree with you. I don't think there's I think there are indies who've reached audiences of many millions and then fumbled the ball on how to keep reaching that audience and keep giving them the thing
I mean,
that
I'm
they
one
got
of them,
excited
right?
about.
That's why you've not played Thomas Was Alone 2, right? You could definitely point to that as an example of exactly what you're describing. But yeah, no, but maybe that's the thing. Maybe there's someone's going to do that. You know, I look at something like, say, Superhot, which has become this big cultural touchstone,
Yes.
and I wonder what they're going to do with that in the next few years. If Superhot's, that's the kind of game that's kind of crossed over into, like, yes, obviously, like you say, the Clay model of just making amazing, creative, original games and then supporting them for years. But I wonder if we'll ever see an indie turn into a mega franchise. Will there ever be a Call of Duty that starts as an indie game? Because that's how it used to work.
That's right. I mean,
Minecraft, I guess, would be a good example of that. But.
Yes, yeah. I am in the same position as you, right? Which is that I have a vested interest in that being the case.
Right,
so,
preferably one of our games. Would be
yeah, exactly. That's right.
So,
but I am a big believer that as we're seeing AAA franchises become more and more risk averse and more stable. I mean, every big AAA game now feels like it has to include the full set of Assassin's Creed style mechanics, and then there's a bunch of other things that knock on from that. As that happens, and as that risk aversion is there, I think people do need to carry titles that have been successful at one scale up to the next scale. I'm not sure how that works out for the actual creatives and developers who started, because I think that is a thing that Superhot's done really well, is bring people in to help do the second stage. The observation that first stage people and second stage people are often quite different in their mentalities kind of exists in Silicon Valley, but I haven't seen many game studios take that approach.
We're still far too attached to, like, auteur theory and the quiet genius who can't be, you know, who the kind of the survivor bias as business model isn't necessarily the right kind of approach.
On that note, what do you think about new approaches in the indie space? If you're an indie starting out now, and I think that's probably true of quite a few of our audience, what's the advice you'd give to somebody to chase the indie dream now?
It's a tough one, isn't it? I don't know. You probably get that question a lot as well, right? It's what's your answer? I'm going to ask you what your answer is first. I'm interested in what your answer is to that.
So my answer is always pick something that is small and that you can make, whoever you are. If it's you as an individual, if it's you as a team. I mean, if it's just you and you're a writer, then make a twine game. If it's a bigger crew, work out what that crew can do in a timely period. Work out who you're making that for. And Raylan, you might want to mute. Work out who you're making that for that's underserved. So make something nobody else is making, because it's a waste of time to make something somebody is making, but make it small and simple is kind of my general kick out advice. And then
it's solid. It's solid. Yeah, no, to be honest, it's similar to mine. The thing, I think that my first piece of advice is always just don't ask people who got financially successful 8 years ago for their advice. That's like my first kind of standard answer. Definitely look to your peers, look at what's working there. The point about making what you can make is, I think, something that is a really hard thing to hear, actually, when you're kind of young and young from a career point of view. You're starting out, you're kind of new to this, and it's always a tricky kind of needle to thread, because you don't want to put someone off, like, being crazy and doing something ridiculous that no one knows they would be able to do. But I think it always, for me, it's always about playing into your talents. It's always about, like you say, like, if you're a writer, write something, because do the thing that you're very good at and no one else is. That's the other thing, is the thing that no one else can do in terms of creative as well. Like, there's a lot of people making games that are aesthetically inspired. I'm guilty of this. Aesthetically inspired by, like, James Cameron movies, Star Wars, and, like, Star Trek. Like, there's enough of that stuff. But if you're obsessed with this obscure TV show that I've never heard of, when you bring your game out that has those kind of influences, it's going to seem mind-blowing to me. And you only have to look at kind of those indie games that have blown up. Often they're just quirky, not necessarily quirky in kind of a cutesy kind of pastel way, but kind of quirky in kind of it's just different to what you've seen before way. I think that makes sense. And that plays into what you're saying of going where no one else is. And the other thing is just finding that opportunity and finding the audience as well. And I think that's probably where I'm a little bit more cynical than most in terms of the indie stuff, where we do still have to sell copies of the game. So we definitely put much more emphasis, I think, on kind of player research and finding out where are people waiting for a game to be served to them, and finding those people, because I think it's cool if your budget's small enough and you've got the runway to do it, to do exactly what you want and don't worry about the consequences and see if you find an audience is great. But I think actually finding out if there's anyone waiting in that field for you to start playing music is really useful and often can be really interesting as it's the kind of conversation we have around Solitaire. It was basically like, you know what? No, like there are Solitaire games, but they've kind of been very tailored to kind of very specific audience. Like, could we convince like a 25-year-old who likes sci-fi action games to play a Solitaire game? And how would we do that? How would we present it? What would we do visually? What would be the design of that game? Mechanically, how do we cater to that new audience? It's not necessarily what did Mike want to say with a Solitaire game. It's more, Mike thought there might be an audience who'd be into that, and actually that would present some interesting design challenges. So I think, thinking of audience more is never a bad thing. And that plays into what you're saying, kind of finding that opportunity. If you can find an audience who's being underserved, who's crying out for content or anything, that works. The problem with the conference circuit and with developers who've had successes is we're talking about stuff that worked for us a while ago.
Correct. Yeah.
Thomas Was Alone worked because there weren't many PC games out that Christmas, and YouTubers were looking for anything excessively pretentious, something that they could show to their audience would get, but also felt a little bit arty. And that's what Thomas Was Alone, that's where Thomas Was Alone kind of landed. It was kind of children's cartoon, but kind of a little bit highfalutin, a little bit pretentious, a little bit Mike in his mid-20s. And that kind of worked, and that filled that void. Something like Superhot worked because at that moment, it was all about kind of game jam culture and interesting, quirky mechanics that you could understand in 5 minutes in a video. And then, you have the streamers come along, you have this process and that process. I don't know what that moment is next. I don't know what the next place where you're going to be able to showcase your game and everyone's going to get excited about it is going to be. But I shouldn't, because I'm now the establishment. I'm the person who because I have an audience, because I have relationships with the platform holders and blah blah blah. Much like yourself, like we don't find the audience that way anymore. We hire PR people. We have businesses to do that. You don't want people like us to know where those players are going to be, because you want the new people who can't get that kind of resource or that kind of structure to find those players there. So I think, don't listen to me, but find somewhere that no one's being served is really cool, because it's much easier to sell food to hungry people than it is just to make food you want to make and hope someone shows up hungry.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that kind of you point out there too is that when you have something that hasn't been delivered on previously, then that gives a story about it that can propagate, right? People can say, this is the game that's like that weird TV show that nobody watches. And I
can get social cachet by knowing about the TV show.
Yeah, exactly.
I can show it to my friends and be like, you won't get this. Like, I get this because you didn't watch Going Around the Twist. It's a little Australian TV, right? So you'll get that kind of cultural kind of cachet. It used to be, I remember when Thomas Was Alone came out, we were in that kind of post indie game, the movie kind of space in the indie space, where it's all about characters and personalities. So all the advice back then was put your face front and center, have a cool origin story, be the person, right? Yeah. And that's the wave I rode, and that's why unfortunately I am now a person who has to worry about everything. But like, that's not how you would do it now, right? There's the indies coming up now. I don't know the names of the people who made these games necessarily. I as a developer, I'll know them, but like as a player, I'm not going to know that information. That's interesting. And I think there's an opportunity there, and I think it's much better to have a different conversation than I'm the person who didn't get into indie game the movie because I was 2 years too late. That's not as interesting a story as what you're saying. And again, we think about that ahead of time. With Solitaire, it was very much like, okay, I'm using that as a practical example because it's what
No,
we've
no,
been
it's
thinking about
great.
for the last few months.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's like with Solitaire, it was like, okay, so the joke here is that we're massively overdoing Solitaire, right? Like people are going to look at this and they're going to go, why did you bother doing this? There's 500 iOS Solitaire games,
Yeah.
many of them very good. Why have you hired Greg Miller to do FMVs? This makes no sense. So we lent hard into that and made that the story in the conversation. And what happened, you know, in terms of how I tweeted about it when we announced it, how we've talked about it kind of in interviews, or how we're going to be talking about it in interviews, all of that is kind of premeditated in such a way that that's going to make for interesting articles. That's going to make for interesting coverage. That review of Solitaire is going to definitely take a moment to go, this is a really silly idea. But we think that there's going to be an audience who are like, I'm up for a silly idea. I'm up for something that's a bit weird or different. And it plays into that originality. And that's, I guess that's marketing, but it's also just a conversation. Games are, you know, you talk to people through marketing, then they play the game, then you're talking to them to improve the game, and then you get to see those conversations spinning out after the game. And at all points in that conversation, you can kind of, there's an artistry, there is a direction to that process all the way through, which is interesting to me. That's the side of it that I find really fascinating, those kind of, how you have that conversation with the audience before and during and after a game.
There's a moment that you touched on there that I've never heard articulated as clearly, and I think is really, really important, and kind of comes to the foundations of what it means to be a game director writ large, right? A game director who is thinking about the overall impact, not just of the decisions inside the game and the problem solving inside the game, but the problem solving that extends out towards how you talk to the audience before it releases, when it releases, after it releases. I really appreciate that little tidbit, and I hope that the audience glom onto that as powerfully as they should.
The whole time you were saying that, I thought you were about to introduce a quote from like a great thinker, but you were actually just complimenting me for what I just said.
Complimenting
awesome.
you. That's right.
I love that.
So,
I thought you were going to say it's like Spielberg said. So, no, cool. No, okay, awesome. I'll take it. I'll take the win on that. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. Very generous.
I think that's really great, and I think it's a thing people should pay attention to and give thought to, because you have to understand how your game exists in the market. If you want to sell games, not everybody wants to sell games, but if that's a thing you want to do, then that conversation at every stage of the game, I think, is something that if people give thought to, they'll be much better off than if not.
I think there's a generation coming up as well who understand this, that media is culture, that it's not that it's not the case of I'm making a thing, I'm making a glass that I can sell you that you can drink coffee from. I'm thinking I'm selling you and I'm partaking in a culture. It's a cultural artifact. It's going to be a thing you can talk about with your friends, or it's going to be a thing that your favorite YouTuber makes a video talking about, and that makes you want to engage with. It's not just commercial. It's not just a product. It is a cultural touchstone and a node in that process of communication. And I think the more we think about the things we make in that sense, I think the better off everyone is. And I think you can make more interesting, meaningful stuff via that. And I look at, like, you know, folks on TikTok now, none of those guys are trying to make a film. They're making moments of conversation. And it's just, I feel like that's where it's all headed, which is interesting, especially if you're someone who quite likes making 5-hour games. Like, it's kind of, I don't know where that fits into where this is all going. So it's gonna be interesting.
My ability to predict the future is at a all-time low at the moment. So
but I think
it's really interesting.
Right now,
One thing I wanted to touch on is, as an Australian conference, I just wanted to talk about geography and what it means to be a UK dev and how that's impacted your life as a dev, because it's something I think that Australians think about a lot, and you're a really active part of the global dev community. You're a really active developer locally, and I just wanted to kind of dig into that kind of being a UK dev.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I've got to be honest and say I'm weirdly, I think at a point, I mean, obviously none of us are local or global right now, but like pre the current situation, I think I was honestly, for a few years, I've been more global than I've been local in terms of just the UK scene, because I moved out of London. That was the main reason. So so in the UK, everything, I know this is true in Australia as well, there are hub cities, and if you're outside of those hub cities, you might as well be in a different country. I definitely got that when I moved out of London, because my partner got work elsewhere. yeah, it's a weird one. I think what's really interesting about being, I guess, not American, which is basically what we're saying, like outside of that bubble, is that there is this kind of weird level up process, because international travel is expensive, and going to conferences is expensive, and meeting people is expensive, and especially then if on top of that you have like language barriers and various other stuff. Like what was weird for me was I definitely had some. I feel like I was in the shallow pool in the UK, kind of just from like an experiential point of view, that I wasn't really aware of how big the game industry was, because for me the games industry was Leamington Spa and London, like, and these were kind of, they were hubs, there were big studios, of course there were, but there wasn't. My first GDC I went to after Thomas Was Alone came out, and I had enough money in the bank to go to GDC. I'd never been to any of those American conferences. So for me, games culture wasn't international. There was the stuff that I understood, which was the stuff made in the UK by people I knew or companies I'd encountered. And then there was these weird kind of American games and Japanese games, and I just had no cultural awareness of how they were put together. So I feel like maybe that's different now, just simply because we're all so much more connected. But like, yeah, it's a weird one. I think it's really weird when you talk to, especially when you talk to Americans about it, because they don't get it. they don't get what that distance is, and the amount of, I guess, historically now kind of business that got done at conventions and conferences. I wasn't in the games industry until I'd been to GDC and E3, in my opinion. Like I'd been on the outskirts. I'd been a worker in the industry, but I don't think I'd been, you know, in the business and didn't know anyone. What is great about this industry, because it's an industry of fans, is that if you make something that people get excited about, like that first GDC where I was the guy who made Thomas Was Alone, everyone was very welcoming and friendly and kind, and for you know, a couple of years, which was lovely. So people did welcome me in then. But like, you know, for years I was out in the wilderness, like not knowing anyone. What's cool about local communities is, to an extent, you don't need the big American community. Like in the UK, we do have this amazing kind of dev community, very supportive, very culturally linked, very you know, very supportive. We also have a lot of institutions that support that, in terms of BAFTA and UKI. We have like these organizations that take it upon themselves to kind of try and support that, which is great. You know, it's not just survival of the fittest. There is some kind of, you know, there are people thinking about this in more of a charitable or cultural sense, which is good. What's it like in Australia? Do you have that kind of infrastructural, kind of governmental and charitable kind of? Do you have like a BAFTA? Do you have those kind of groups?
At a state level, so we don't have a direct equivalent to BAFTA, but at a state level, we have various initiatives in different states. Obviously, Melbourne's been really active for a very long time, and the other states are starting to come up and play ball. We used to have federal incentives, which was quite nice, but the federal government's moved away from that over the last 5 years or so, and that's left a real gap in the kind of in the steps. I mean, we talk in Australia a lot about the kind of broken treads on the stairway, but that there's, I mean, events like GCAP and PAX Australia and Melbourne Games Week, those are really great. We get great international guests like yourself. Everybody gets a chance to showcase things.
The flight was lovely, by the way. Really nice.
I mean, it's rare that anybody says that about the flight to Australia, but we've got a win on this one.
Yeah, it's been really, really cool. Very easy, very easy.
On one of the other things, we've talked a bit about the stuff that falls into ambition. I want to talk about connection and how you find collaborators and co-conspirators and team members, and what that looks like for you, and how you identify somebody as a good fit.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't do many kind of interviews, and kind of, we're just starting to now because we're getting to a scale where we have to. Yeah. But historically, we've really relied on very kind of basically just kind of me finding people I like and who I'm a fan of, and kind of letting them know that I'm a fan, and then kind of coming back to them a few months later with an idea, you know. And so I've always been much more, I guess it's more like, it's been more casual. It's been more like putting bands together, essentially, like going, oh, that would work really well with what we want to do, or or this kind of thing, or meeting people through projects, or meeting people kind of just in the ether. So like, yeah, I guess coming back to Solitaire, Jen, who's the amazing character artist for that, is someone who I've been a fan of for years, and she'd worked with a buddy of mine, Jake, on his last thing. So I kind of like was kind of sidling in to try and kind of say, hey, can we maybe work together? John Everest, who's the composer, is just someone I'm genuinely a big fan of, and started following on Twitter and listening to his music, and started chatting to a lot of Twitter, to be honest, more Twitter than probably is healthy for a company. What we've started doing now, is kind of doing the more kind of, putting out jobs and stuff like that. It's been, but yeah, even then, we do heavily rely on recommendations and the kind of the community and those kind of links and hearing about talented people. What's really cool. I feel like the games industry is pretty good at celebrating talented people on their way up, and definitely like that's how I tend to hear about someone. Is I'll just hear a few friends talking about them, or I'll see a cool thing that they made, being shared around social media. And yeah, I just basically just have running lists in my head of like, I'm working with you. I don't know what on, but at some point there's going to be a thing that makes sense. And then the other thing for me that is a massive part of it that I think the game industry is generally terrible at is retention, and making it so that people want to keep working with us, which makes hiring a lot easier. We've got a lot of our team have been with us for years and years and years and years and years. Someone like Nick Tringali, who came in and he was doing additional 3D art on volume. So he literally made a desk and 2 cupboards, I think, for volume. Just because our main artist was busy or couldn't get to it. So Nick came in as a graduate, did that, and then just on multiple games after was doing some 3D art assets, and then mentioned to me that he was getting into coding, and he was in coding his own indie game. So I got him to do some coding on some of our projects, and slowly but surely he worked his way through. On John Wick, he co-designed it with me and coded it, and now he's directing a game with us and kind of doing his thing. So it's an interesting thing where I think one thing that big industry is very good at is careers. Not perfect, obviously, in lots of ways, but like people can step through. And I think indie often it's more casual. The relationships are more casual in that sense, that people come in, work with you on one thing, go away. That's something we've actively tried to combat, and generally we tend to keep people around for 2 or 3 projects. It's really interesting with Solitaire because we've kind of officially finished that, but like I'm definitely going to try and bring back everyone who's worked on it for the next thing, or for a thing, 2 projects from now. So that's about treatment of people. That's about making sure everyone had a good time working with us, that we have a good reputation in the industry, that there aren't stories about us being an awful place to work or whatever. Being anti-crunch goes a long way. Our company is well known and respected for that, which is always fun to see. My name is mentioned more in relation to like talking about crunch now than it is anything else, because it's a stupid, awful thing. We shouldn't do it. But if you're a company that has that attitude, it makes it easier to bring people back because you didn't burn them out last time on the last project. So yeah, I think it comes down to paying a lot of attention, spending too much time looking for new talent and finding new people who are doing interesting things who you think you can figure out a way to work with. Of course, as well as part of that, there's a really interesting opportunity there for, like, especially in the indie space, everyone's trying to make their own games. So often you can find someone who's making their own game, but, could do with some extra cash while they're doing that, so can come in and do a little bit of extra work. Or you can find these kind of weird moments in people's schedules. We did with Subsurface Circular, Mu Yu, who coded that, is a foam sword, and he made Knights and Bikes. And he was basically, him and Rex were working on that, and basically Rex had just this enormous amount of art he had to produce for the next build, and Mu had basically 2 months where he didn't really have any coding tasks. So we went, okay, you're coding my next game then, and come over. And that was great because that meant, from my perspective, I got an amazing world-class coder to come in and do my stupid little text adventure game. But for him, obviously, he got some budget that could go back into Knights and Bikes. So it's kind of these kind of deals and things that happen in game dev. Because if you have a reputation as someone who's good to work with, which I think I do, it's a weird thing to say about yourself, but I think it's true. And if you're kind of paying attention to who's out there. So yeah, you want to recruit people, just look at the people I've started following in the last month. There's probably some talented people in there. I shouldn't say that to people, but I think that's a good way of going about it. And then retention, which goes a long way.
I think
and,
those
and
are super important factors, and as you say, you have to do a lot less hiring if you can retain people because you treat them well, right? Like, so
it's so much easier. And the other thing is you can start to have things like house style. It's funny, we got we put out, I put out some screenshots of Solitaire Circular today, and one of the comments was, "Oh, I love Daz's colors," and that's because Daz Watford has done the color palettes on every single game we've shipped since. He even did the colors on Thomas Was Alone, and it's the first game he didn't do the colors on. And it was this weird thing of like, oh yeah, this is the first game we put out that didn't have at least 2 days work from this specific guy who's been on all of our games. And, you know, and it just leads to this consistency. And especially when you're jumping genres as much as we are, a lot of the time we're reaching out to our audience of people who've played our previous games and going, can you come with us to this weird thing? We're trying something new. And you're not going to take everyone with you, of course, but like you're trying to kind of talk them into coming with you. And if like, you know, Chris Randall, who's done the sound design again on every single game we've ever made, you might not know in the trailer that you're hearing sounds he made, but those sounds are going to have they're going to mean something to you as a Bithell game, right?
Yes, yeah.
So it's kind of, it's worked well for us in terms of that retention. So what I'm saying is there's commercial reasons to be a good human being as well. Like it has its benefits beyond just being smug on keynotes.
I have to say, I've seen that argument put forward multiple times. There's really good arguments for diversity, for example, that come about because of commercial.
Very similar thing,
there are commercial reasons to be diverse.
Massively.
But I've found that in the end, the people doing it tend to be doing it because they're decent people, not because they're chasing the commercial imperative, if that makes sense. So
it's true, but we have to tell the money people that we're doing it because of the commercial reasons, right? We have to trick them. We have to it's just you and me talking here. We have to pretend that there's a commercial reason to it.
Well, it's always good to sell the benefits of being good human, right? Like, so in the hope that more people will come along for the ride.
Look, the reason we have computers to play games on is because a bunch of people cooperated.
Yeah.
Like we are a species that does better when we collaborate and cooperate better. Which is a lesson that we could learn in many areas of life.
Yeah.
But like, so I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, like, it makes sense. It makes sense that if the tribe is working well together, then they're going to achieve the cool thing. Something about mammoth. I don't know where I was going with that metaphor, but like, yeah, we're social creatures. That's our species' superpower. So why would you work against that by being an arsehole?
Can I ask, and this is really a personal question for me. You run a studio, you do the writing. What's your process for like getting space to write? How do you write?
Tell everyone to go away. Usually, I hate writing. Which I think is true of most writers I've met. Seems to be a pretty consistent thing. I much prefer coding, so that's what's nice about Solitaire. Solitaire I actually coded more than I wrote, which was really fun. That's why it's so buggy. So for me, writing is something I can't do it when I'm in anything less than a good mood.
Yeah.
If I'm in a bad mood, I'll do any other task I need to do on a project. But if I wake up and the sun's in the sky and the birds are singing, then I will go to Alexander Slawinski, my business partner, and I'll say, today's a writing day. Can you just deal with everything for me, please, today? And I'll be there for the team call because it's important as the boss to be there for the team call every day. But like beyond that, I'm gonna schedule around it and I'm gonna move things around. It is one of the benefits of being the owner of the company and also the writer, right? Like it's a nice perk that I can do that and I have that flexibility. But yeah, no, it's a weird one. I hate it. I hate writing. I hate it. I find it stressful. It puts me in a bad mood. I can't do it for more than a couple of hours at a time. Yeah. But it's one of those things that I know is something people like about our games. No one else can write in my voice. There are many better writers than me, but the specific way our games feel does seem to be very close to me. And when people try and imitate me, it ends up very kind of Dick Van Dyke-y. Yeah. It's got kind of this weird kind of, it's a different accent. It doesn't sound like me. So it's this weird kind of I guess, yeah, it's a kind of deal with the devil I've done, that I have to write things in order to sell games.
How many of those writing days are in a typical project?
That depends on the project, really.
Yeah.
So with Solitaire, I'd say I spent, because we've got so with that we've got a story, kind of these ridiculous FMVs we shot. So we've got the kind of story that's about 20-25 minutes. Most of our games, for some reason, the story content always ends up being 20 minutes. However, whatever we aim for, however long the game is, it always ends up with 20 minutes of audio files of voiceover. I don't know why that is. So that's usually, page a minute, bit less for us usually, because a wordy scripts obviously is the voiceover. So that's, getting through 10 drafts of a script, it's usually about 3 or 4 days for me to get something I'm proud of in that sense. With Solitaire, I opened that up. So we've got 3 credited writers on that. We've got Alexander, who did, he for the first time, because he's a former journalist, so he loves writing. He's never written any of our games before. I've not let him. This was one where we had these kind of missions and text, lots of content to write. So he stepped up and did that and did a great job. And then Tiny the Past as well did some stuff on our characters. And there's some that sharing the load has been really useful. But then something like Subsurface Circular, that was mainly writing. Subsurface Circular was 2 months, because it's all that branching dialogue and stuff. What's nice about Subsurface Circular was that was very much, I'm definitely with the writing, I'm definitely a very much like a workman kind of mentality. Like I'm all about structure. I'm all about, Save the Cat and, Robert McKee and all this, all the really awful how to write stories books. I do all of that stuff. And
I think that's a real benefit in games, because I think most people are not doing the basics. So structure and thought and consideration.
It's a good way in if you're a games person.
Often
right?
absent in games. Exactly. Exactly. I don't think
it's a good way in. It's structural. There are spreadsheets. It's great. It feels nerdy. So because I take that approach, usually I spend a lot of time planning, and then with something like Subsurface Circular, it's easier to write. Once you've got the structure of a Subsurface Circular style game, the writing is much more conversational. It's more akin to kind of, I don't know, someone's rude to you in a shop, and the conversation you have with them on the walk home, like the imaginary conversation you have where you tell them that they were being rude and awful and everyone applauds. That's kind of the writing process on a Subsurface Circular. It's more just imagining conversations, which flows to me better. What takes time is the structural side. And also when I try and write stuff that can't be a conversation. So with Solitaire, it's a lot of Greg talking to you in monologues. So that's harder to write, because what I want is that kind of, and I'm not comparing myself as a writer, but like that Sorkin-y thing of back and forth is very easy to write. I feel very comfortable doing that. But having someone, I'm going to talk to you for 2 minutes about and I have to convey these 10 pieces of information about the story. And I need to convey this about my character, but subtly, so that it's an interesting thing for you to discover. That's the stuff that takes a while. So it's one of those, how long's a bit of a string.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting close to time.
I apologize. I've gone rambling.
It's fabulous. We've touched on all the big things I really wanted to touch on.
Good. Okay.
What I'd love to close out on is, what trends do you think there are in the games industry at the moment that are genuinely exciting? Where do you see the excitement in the future?
Exciting is an interesting caveat to add to that, because there's lots of trends. I'm trying to think of any that are exciting. So some of them are scary.
I think it's a very scary world right now, and that's part of the reason. I think it's a scary world in general. I think it's a scary world for devs, but I also do think there's a lot happening that will lead to good stuff down the line.
And I think weirdly, this is a generation where I'm actually excited about the tech. Which is interesting, because I shouldn't be, because it's the least interesting part of any console generation is the wires in the box. But what's really interesting to me about the new Xbox, or new Xboxes, and the new PS5s is there's a lot of power in them that is utterly invisible to the player in a way that excites me, because what that means is, as an indie who hasn't got the team to optimize and really get the most out of the console, I can not catch up with AAA, of course, but like there's stuff I can start to approach, which would be, I'd be laughed out of a room for on previous gen consoles. So for example, the thing that's really exciting to me is bigger worlds, is open worlds, is kind of telling stories and making games that have bigger spaces, less loading screens. All of our stuff is very kind of PS2 era kind of corridors and dog legs, right? Yeah. So the idea that we'd be able to get away with something approaching a bigger space just because the consoles by definition are going to be better at that stuff, and the way streaming's working and loading's working on those, that's interesting to me. With indies, I often like I feel like for us, because we can't get the most out of the console, there's no point in someone like me trying. Like we're not a tech heavy team. There are indies obviously who do massive pioneering awesome work, but we're not one of those teams. We're always going to be riding in that middle range of, so what can Unity do now? Yeah. And what's interesting with, I think, with these platforms and the way the power's gone up, but the AAA haven't quite worked out how they want to use that power beyond ray tracing yet, which is tough for players to see, and even tougher for players to notice when it's not there. If you make the right artistic choices, that there's not many shiny surfaces. That to me feels like there's some headroom. Feels like there's an opportunity for me to make a rickety, awful kind of cart that I can ride down that tunnel, and the larger space that's there for me to work in is going to allow me to make a bigger car without having to worry about making it really streamlined. The metaphors are terrible on this call, I apologize. But that's interesting to me. Feels like there's opportunities for big indie games, just in terms of geography, not in terms of budget necessarily. No. But I also think there's interesting things happening in terms of prop gen. It's really interesting where prop gen's gone in like how mundane and boring it's become in the best possible way. Yeah. When you look at how AAA have been using it in open world games, kind of quietly getting on with it for the last few years, and how they've managed to streamline and just not using it for the fancy stuff, not making the promises to the player that you can go anywhere and do whatever and visit any world, but just making the promise to the player that there's going to be some grass on the ground. Yeah. And a level designer didn't have to put it there because we can just place grass and trees and we can do that stuff relatively safely. It'll look okay. That's that side of it, that kind of mundane procedural generation kind of trickling down, and then that kind of being combined with this idea of faster load times and potentially bigger spaces. It feels like we might be kind of indie might be approaching that kind of end of PS2 era where we might not be able to make GTA, but we might be able to start to think about games that take place on bigger canvases, and that'd be cool. I'd like to play in some stuff in that world. At some point.
That's super exciting. I have 100 more questions that follow on from that, and
at least of all,
I'm
where
excited.
You get the money to do that, Mike? That's ridiculous.
Well, cash
it's a
and
fair
budgets,
question.
cash and budgets are a absolutely
in your mind. You can spend as much money as you like, right?
Yeah. But also, I think that you're right to observe that the broader opportunities for funding have changed. There's everybody's chasing Netflix models. Everybody's looking for titles that can act as linchpins. For developers like yourself, you're in a really good position into that new world. And there's a whole conversation there about where that's all headed, but not today. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being so generous with the details of your process and the inside workings of your studio. I really appreciate it. And
no worries.
I'd like the audience to stand up in their chairs and applaud for Mike so that he can hear that in the recording.
Thank you. I'll stand by the window when this goes out and just listen.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks very much, Mike.
Cheers.